I remember as a young man, I was always looking for the one sport I would be good at without working at it. Now I'm getting to be an old man and I still haven't found it. Unfortunately, some people are like that when it comes to having a good marriage. They say they want a good marriage, but they just aren't willing to actually work at it. And we've talked about a number of commitments that you're going to have if you are going to have the kind of marriage that honors God and is good for you. And without a doubt, one of the commitments that you're going to have to make if your marriage and your family is going to be God glorifying is a commitment. You need a commitment to working at your marriage. We've talked about the priority of marriage. We need to talk about the perspiration that's required for a good marriage. There are very few things in life that get better without a willingness to work at it. And marriage is definitely not one of those things. You might picture it like a garden. That's the image we get in Proverbs chapter 24, where he describes a garden that's overgrown with thistles and irritating nettles, totally a mess, unproductive. And the reason the garden is like this is because the person who owned the garden was lazy. He was unwilling to work. He wouldn't put in the effort. And of course, the same is true with having a God-honoring and personally satisfying marriage. I often tell people there's more than one way to ruin a garden. One way you can ruin a garden is by getting a shovel and going out there and going crazy, running around slashing things. Or there's an easier way to ruin a garden, and that is just don't do anything. Good gardens are a result of a lot of work, and I've been to some beautiful gardens, and while those gardens were different in many ways, in one way they were all the same. Good gardens just don't happen. They're always a result of a lot of effort. They take time. If I want to have a good marriage, it's going to take time. If you want to have a good family, it's going to take time. It's going to require discipline. If you're going to have a good garden, it's going to require effort, self-denial, focused attention, determination, perseverance, and the same is true with a good marriage. It's going to require sacrifice. If you're going to have a good garden, it's going to involve pain. It's going to involve getting some blisters. And it's going to require a different kind of pain to have a good marriage, but it's going to require definitely self-sacrifice. It's going to require dealing with problems. If I want a good garden, I got to pull the weeds, and I got to deal with insects and diseases that the plants can get. And if I'm going to have a good marriage, you're going to have a good family, it's going to require that you actually address problems. You can't just overlook them. It's going to require proactive care. If you're going to have a good garden, you got to fertilize, you got to water, you got to nurture. The same is true with a good marriage. It's going to require perseverance. If you want a good garden, you're going to have to be vigilant. You're going to be watchful. You have to be alert. You might have to do some things like study, actually, plants and when they should be planted, all that stuff. It's going to involve learning. And the same is true with having a good marriage. Proverbs 14:23 puts it like this: in all toil there is profit, but mere talk only leads to poverty. And that's true in every area of life, but it's definitely true in marriage. First, it's true because when two people get married for the first time, they're new at it, at least with each other. They've never had to do this before. And so there's a lot of skills that they have to get better at, and the only way they get better at them is through practice. Getting married, one writes, as good as it may be for those who choose it, is nonetheless a crisis in the lives of newlyweds because it requires radical changes in their habits and behavior, in their assessment of their world and themselves, in their priorities, and in their responsibilities. In other words, there's a lot to learn when you get married. And that includes each other, because not only are they new at marriage, whether they realize it or not, they're kind of new to each other. They know each other, but they don't really know each other. As one author writes, marriage immediately forces changes upon the partners, which no matter how well prepared they thought they were, surprise them and require a new and specialized labor from both of them. This is the fact. The woman does not know who her husband is until he is her husband, nor the man his wife until she exists as wife. Before the marriage, these people were fiancés, not spouses. Fiancés and spouses are different creatures, and the second creature does not appear until the first has passed away. Did the courtship last many, many years? It doesn't matter. Were they friends long before they initiated courtship? It doesn't matter. They still can't know the spouse until he or she is a spouse. And there isn't a spouse until there is marriage, which is part of why there's a need for effort, for perspiration. This is something new. And second, they're having to learn to live with someone who's different, very different than they are. Obviously, husbands and wives are different, and they're different in a number of ways. Their family backgrounds are different. Some come from authoritarian families, others more democratic, others just sort of live and let live. There are obviously physical differences, and whether the world wants to acknowledge it or not, there are differences in the way men and women typically work. They're going to have different tendencies, they're going to have different personalities. Often they're attracted to each other because they're different. But then, after a while, those differences become challenging. I often say, man, this thing that should be your greatest strength has become your greatest weakness. They have different perspectives. I remember counseling a couple about hospitality, and the one believed that family could come over anytime and for as long as they wanted without ever asking. The other wanted to make plans, and so they wanted the family to let them know when they were coming in for how long. And man, they both felt so right. They have different expectations and desires. You can see this even among people who are not married. One person will think friendship means that you have to get together and pour your heart out all the time. The other is more content to just get together once in a while and chat. They have different gifts and abilities. Something might be easy for one and hard for the other. And it's amazing how hard it can be to understand when something is difficult for someone else when it's easy for you. Marriage requires work because you're living with someone for the first time in this unique way, this unique covenant relationship, and you're living with someone who's going to be different than you, and because you're both selfish sinners. My wife and I, we often say there's hard and there is hard. So going to hell is hard. Having to put your wash in the laundry basket is not hard. But it often feels incredibly hard. Why? Because we're so selfish. And because we're so selfish, a lot of what should really be fairly easy in marriage requires an enormous amount of effort because it requires death to self. Which is why I think we have to remember not only the need for perspiration in marriage, but also that God's design is for the marriage relationship to be permanent, or at least as long as we both shall live. That's the normal way marriage is supposed to work. Because you know, what usually happens when we enter into relationships is that they're enjoyable for a while until we get to know each other better. And then when we discover that to continue, we have to die to self to be able to maintain that relationship, we find a way out, or at least a way not to have to spend so much time with one another. We don't like work, especially the work of dying to self, and yet while that's more comfortable for us to kind of drift apart, it's not usually as spiritually good for us. And so because God loves us and wants us to grow, he's designed this relationship, this one relationship, to be a permanent relationship that we can't run away from and that we have to work on if we're actually going to enjoy it. It's kind of like, man, you've got to figure this out if you're going to survive. And so we have to remember, look, if we're going to have a good marriage, we have to work at it. And if we're going to work at it, one of the ways we can motivate ourselves is by remembering that God's design for this is for it to be permanent. In fact, every couple really who's married should look at their marriage as if they were on the 10th floor of a building with their mates from which there are no exits and fire breaks out. And there are only two choices at that point. Because there's no exits and you're on the 10th floor, either put out the fire or die. Or you should look at your marriage as though you're on a small island with your mate where no planes ever come, where there are no boats and no materials to build a boat. This island is thousands of miles away from any landmass, so you can't get off by swimming, and the island's so small you can't avoid the other person. Your choice is either be miserable if you're having troubles with that other person, suicide or homicide, or figure it out. And that's the choice, obviously. Figure it out. You've got to figure it out. By God's grace, you've got to figure it out. And this is one of the reasons we make vows when we get married. They're vows to God and they're vows to each other. And those vows are not just, hey, I'm going to love you today, but I might not tomorrow. Or I promise to love you if everything goes well. I hope those weren't your marriage vows. They were a declaration instead to sacrificial love and faithfulness when things are good, when things are bad, forever, until death do us part. Jay Adams talks about how couples often come for counseling saying, you know, we just don't feel like we love each other anymore. And they come saying that, thinking that means the counselor's just going to have to agree with them that they should get a divorce. And he responds by saying, what? You don't feel like you love each other anymore? Then I guess that means we need to get to work, because you're going to have to learn to love each other. One counselor puts it like this: your marriage is like a good retirement plan. As long as you keep the deposits flowing, the account grows. The marriage develops like compound interest over time. Small investments of love and nurture reap great dividends in relational happiness. No one in their right mind would squander a solid investment account that has been growing through the years to take up a shaky, speculative venture. It doesn't make good sense. If the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, you should try watering your own. If you feel like the pleasure's gone out of your marriage, or the romance, or the marriage is not meeting your basic need for encouragement and love, then you have to work at it. There's no other way. The only action that makes sense is to dig in and to recommit yourself to your present marriage. And that's because ultimately God is good. He knows what's best. When he designed marriage, he designed it to normally be a permanent relationship. And he didn't do that because he was unkind or cruel. This is the God who sent his son to die in your place. And so even if it feels like it's so cruel to make you continue, it's actually for your good. Now, of course, we know that there are some times the Bible talks about where divorce is a legitimate option. And you're not sinning to get divorced during those times. But you know what? It's kind of like you're out hiking and a massive rock falls on your arm. You know, you're going to try everything before you have to cut off your arm, right? If you can't get out. Cutting off your arm is a last resort. And even when you make that decision, you know it's going to impact your life forever. And so normally, marriage, don't be surprised, it's going to take work. And that's a good thing. And to motivate you to work at it, God's designed the marriage relationship to be a permanent one, as long as you both shall live.